welcome to The Drum. I'm Tim Palmer. Coming up tonight, does Australia need stronger privacy laws? Should David Hicks be allowed to keep any money made from telling his story? And as the final space shuttle mission enters the home stretch, we take a look at the highs and the lows of the program. Our panel tonight, lawyer Greg Barnes, Jessica Brown from the Centre for Independent Studies, and former diplomat Bruce Hay. Well, it hasn't taken long for Britain's phone hacking scandal to have an impact in Australia. It's prompted a new push for tougher privacy laws. The federal government has released a discussion paper raising the idea of legislating on the issue.
Seen the kind of reports we've seen from the United Kingdom, that people would be asking themselves, could that happen here? People care about privacy, and so they should. They also care about freedom of the press, and so they should. So we'll obviously be seeking views on how these two things can best work together.
But Tony Abbott was keen to make a distinction between stronger privacy laws and a weaker media, accusing the Prime Minister of attempting to intimidate the press.
Happy to look at proposals for greater privacy protection, but what I will never support is any attempt to try to bluff the media out of doing its job, which is to hold bad governments to account.
Well, I won't go around the panel and ask, are you in favour of privacy? It's a bit of a motherhood one, but are you in favour of a tort of privacy, giving people the right to sue for it? Greg Barnes.
Well, there, as I say it as a lawyer, yes I am. And the reason, Tim, is because it is a fundamental human right. Of course, begs the question, well, if we had a Human Rights Act in Australia, we wouldn't have to be doing this, but that's a separate question. At the moment, the problem is the law is very uncertain, and suing for breach of privacy is difficult. What this will do will give people who are damaged, have their reputations damaged, that opportunity, and the media should be held to account and have to pay those damages in the same way as any other person in the litigation system.
Bruce, at roughly the time the Australian Law Reform Commission were deciding that to recommend there should be a tort for privacy, some sort of action, the Daily Telegraph was publishing a picture of a footballer and a sportswoman in a toilet cubicle in some sort of embrace. Have the newspapers and tabloid television brought this on themselves?
I don't think it's necessary to go down this path. I think that if it's quite obvious when privacy's been breached. What we don't know in this country is when your telephone's been tapped or your privacy's been impinged upon in other ways. So I would like to see the AFP under greater scrutiny. I'd like to see ASIO under greater scrutiny. I'd like to see a committee of Parliament, as we have with Defence and Foreign Affairs, be formed, come into place to look at the AFP, because if anybody's breached privacy over the last 12 years, it's been the AFP and ASIO. Setting that aside, though, if it was to do with media invasions of privacy, and the law came in with a large public interest clause, that the material could still be published if it was in the public interest, would you be satisfied on that basis? Yes, I think that's common sense. But, you know, I would have hoped that we had mechanisms through through press councils with real powers to be able to do that, rather than the self-regulation that exists at the moment. Jessica, there have been suggestions this will just be another avenue for the rich to protect themselves. Do you think that's the danger?
I think that is the danger, and I would really suggest that we proceed with caution on this. As you said, it's a bit of a motherhood statement, and everyone is going to want the right to privacy. And I think everyone would be horrified if anything like the phone hacking scandal were to happen, and wouldn't want that to happen to them. But I think there's a real danger in setting up these laws which are sort of overreaching, that there is an overreach, and that they are used in unintended ways to protect people.
What sort of ways?
Well, I think the difficulty is public interest is not an absolute. I think it's a very subjective thing, and it's like pornography, you know it when you see it, but it's really difficult to come up with a catch-all legislative way to prevent it. So, look, I don't think it's a bad idea, but I think proceed with extreme caution.
Greg Barnes, courts competent to determine something like public interest? They did it in defamation for years.
Courts are more than competent to do that, and judges are more than competent to do it, as you rightly say, Tim, in defamation cases. Look, I think that there is no public interest served if, as you say, the Daily Telegraph had a footballer and his girlfriend in a toilet cubicle. Where could it be possibly said that there's any public interest in publishing a story like that? And of course the rich might use these laws. The rich use all laws because the legal system allows the rich greater access than the poor. That's not the issue. The issue here is that Australians are not protected. This is a fundamental human right. Because we don't have a Human Rights Act in this country, we're not protected, and we need to do something about it. And I think, it's not carte blanche. It should never be carte blanche for the media. And I've seen people whose privacy has been breached, and I've acted for them, and they suffer terribly, and they should have some recourse to the courts.
without such a recourse in tort law, Bruce. What would you suggest? What do you advise? People are left without a right, aren't they?
Yeah, and courts, proceeding to court is an expensive business, and we do need to have a proper press council, a press council with teeth that can take these complaints and people can go to something like a properly constituted press council without it costing them any money and put their complaint and have that heard. Yeah.
Well, of course, much of this comes from Fleet Street, and Fleet Street has led all the way to Downing Street. Like Rupert Murdoch, British Prime Minister David Cameron has been forced to eat some humble pie of his own during a fiery session of Parliament. He's conceded he made mistakes and there may not have been enough transparency when it came to relationships between politicians and media executives.
But frankly, I think we all need to be clear, particularly the two main parties, that the level of contact has been very great, that we did spend too much time, frankly, trying to get on with media companies to get our message across. And as a result, we put on the back burner too often, the last government, the last opposition, we put on the back burner too often the issues of how to regulate the media. That's the mistake that we made. We've all got to be honest about it.
He's also admitted, with hindsight, he wouldn't have hired former News of the World editor Andy Coulson as his media advisor. But the British opposition leader wasn't impressed by the Prime Minister's mea culpa.
Isn't good enough. Yeah. Because people... It's not about hindsight, Mr. Speaker. It's not about whether Mr. Coulson lied to him. It is about all the information and warnings that the Prime Minister ignored.
Jessica Brown, David Cameron there is closest he's come to expressing regret over the Coulson thing, but he still hasn't explained much to the questions about exactly the process of hiring Andy Coulson. How's he travelling overall, do you think?
Look, I actually think he's doing okay under pressure. But look, the reason he hired Andy Coulson, I'm sure, was because it was a way into the Murdoch press and he wanted to have an in. And the British politics and the media is extremely close. And look, I'm sure they are here too. The question of what needs to be done about that, how that can be regulated, is the government in the position to regulate its own relationships with the media? I mean, this is quite tricky. It's like regulating lobbying in a way. You know, it's sort of good intentions, very difficult to do.
Bruce, that's what David Cameron was saying, really, isn't it? That he said all of us, all parties, have been too busy cozying up to the media rather than measuring up the media. What are they going to do from here, do you think?
I don't know what they're going to do in Britain, but the situation there is very similar to the situation here, where the media and politics have collapsed into each other, and you haven't got this separation between the two that you necessarily must have if a democracy is going to function properly. So it's become too close, too cosy, too blurred, and right down to first name terms and people going off in Canberra and having dinner and lunch together. I'm not against that, but they have to know what the lines are. And those lines are no longer obvious to anybody.
I don't know. If it's so cosy, why is the government and the Greens so keen to regulate the media? I mean, it can't be that cosy. They hate each other.
Well, some elements do. The Greens are on the outer, aren't they? I mean, no one's loving the Greens at the moment, even though the Greens might be saying the things that we like to hear said by people in politics.
They're not really on the outer. They're right in the middle of it. I mean, they're driving this whole push.
Well, I'd like to think so, but it is complicated. But I can remember the days when there was a much bigger and more proper division, if you like, between people in government and the media. And it meant that the government was under much better scrutiny on issues like climate change, on issues like water. We're not getting the reporting on water or on agriculture, use of agricultural land, on a whole range of issues that just don't happen, because between the two of them...
But can you ever regulate on that balance of coverage, on that concentration of coverage?
No, regulation won't do it. It requires a change of attitude, a change of attitude on the part of government, on the part of editors. For instance, out of all of this, Julia's made a few statements yesterday about you know, the need to look at the media, but she hasn't been specific about it. But are people going to stand up to the media, and is the media going to start really questioning government on a whole range of issues that are fundamental, like infrastructure, like health, like what happens to the money in New South Wales?
Isn't this the problem that the government has at the moment, though? They think that they're being questioned too strongly by the media and that they're not being given a fair enough hearing.
Look, yes, they're as weak as water. I mean, you know, these are people that have the spine of jellyfish, and you only have to ask them one question and they go to ground. They need to be really put under the hammer. They're using our taxpayers' dollars. And what happened in Defence Department? We have 3 rusty ships. We have the Secretary of the Department of Defence. We have the head of the Department of... No one's to blame. I'm sorry. But the Minister himself has to be questioned as to why this happened. These are our dollars. These are decisions that are taken on our behalf. We need to know, and we're not getting that information, and we're not getting those decisions.
Greg Barnes, away from the political response in Downing Street and back to the Murdochs, there was another report that was overshadowed a bit by the Cameron interrogation, if you like, that went out from the MPs suggesting that Lord MacDonald, looking at this emails dossier that was right at the heart of the Murdoch's evidence the other day, said it took him 3 to 5 minutes in this report today. It was blindingly obvious it had to go to the police, and again he said it was clear, or the MPs ruled from this, it was clear that News International had thwarted police investigations. No matter how they went in the hearing, these are the central truths that could undo the whole operation, aren't they?
Well, I think there's a long way to go in that, and it's a very, very big company. I should declare that I write for the Hobart Mercury, so I'm in the southernmost port of the Murdoch Empire. I would say this, that Lord MacDonald, of course, is a former DPP, so he's a very, very distinguished criminal lawyer in the UK. And if it only took him 3 to 5 minutes to work it out, it would have been quite searing off the page, as it were. I think that the other issue that David Cameron is not talking about is why did he hire Andy Coulson? He hired Coulson, we all know why, but what would lead you to get Coulson in your office after he'd been given the kibosh from News of the World? We all knew why at the time, and there he is hiring him. I mean, just the most extraordinary. I think Cameron showed great ineptitude. I think that one of the issues here, which may come about of this, is that if Cameron and George Osborne, his Chancellor, who apparently used to run around saying, "Oh, I've been invited by the Murdochs to a party," you know, and get all excited, you know. Have a look at Nick Clegg, who of course is the Deputy Prime Minister and Liberal Democrat, who sits there each day very uneasy about this, because I think the person who's looking really good out of this is Ed Miliband, the Labor leader, and looking very strong.
The best thing that could happen to the Murdochs potentially in Britain at the moment is that this does fan out to all the other mastheads in Fleet Street. And the police have now asked for files from a previous probe, 8 years old, that was called Operation Motorman. They contain 4,000 requests from 300 journalists about their dealings with private eyes, most from the Daily Mail, Sunday People and the Daily Mirror. Is this the best thing for Rupert?
Look, I think it is. It shows you a culture, though, in the media. And somebody said to me recently, of course, journalists hire private eyes. I mean, I do find that disturbing. I mean, with respect to your own profession, Tim, I mean, journalists are not the police. And I've always had a problem, of course, with the way in which some newspapers in this country have pursued stories where they've really judged people guilty before the cases have gone through the courts. And I think it's a good reason for suppression orders, which is very unpopular with the media. But I think we need to have this debate about the power of the media and how the media operates and what it does to get a story up and what it does in terms of then potentially prejudicing trials. Now, I think that this is not just about the Murdochs, but this is about the way the media operates, not just in Australia, but in the UK and probably in the US as well.
Still with the Murdochs, and Wendy Dung's fierce defence of her husband, Rupert Murdoch, when he was attacked by a pie-wielding comedian, was an instant hit on the internet. Now it's also a cartoon, those wacky Taiwanese animators who famously recreated Tiger Woods' fight with his wife and Osama bin Laden's death have turned their talents to Wonder Wendy.
The World Hacking hearing was interrupted when a man attacked Rupert Murdoch with a plate full of shaving cream. The attack was foiled when Murdoch's wife, Wendy Dung, pounced to the defence of her husband.
Well, Jessica Brown, once you're an internet meme, you've got it made, haven't you? Should the torch pass to Wendy, not James, potentially, in the Murdoch Empire?
Maybe it should, yeah. Wendy's definitely the star to come out of this.
What did you make of it, Greg Barnes?
Extraordinary, obviously very athletic. We haven't seen a pie for a while. It did remind me, Tim, of there was a guy, I think, running around the late 90s who used to do it regularly at G7s and various other places.
Those
the pie
French,
man from
French activist comedians.
That's right. But we haven't. That's what it reminded me of. We haven't seen it for a while. It's the return of the pie. But I think this got done with shaving cream.
Bruce, hey, I don't know if you watched the whole episode, but that shuffling Bobby in the last scene, moving very slowly off the screen, it's pretty emblematic of the whole Scotland Yard input into this, isn't it?
Did you see the way James reacted in that the real footage? He didn't know what to do, and he held back. I would say, if I had to judge him, if I was back in my military days, that he was a bit of a coward. That Deng is not, and she's going to get that empire, and we all know that Deng will get the empire. That's what all the rest of the Murdoch siblings are worried about. But you could see that this is one very strong, very determined woman. When her husband was tapping the table, who was it that leant over and said, "Stop it"? Poor old Rupert. I mean, she's carrying his jewels around in her bag, and he's long ago been emasculated. So I think Deng will take over the Murdoch empire, such as it is. I mean, it's going to break up. Bits of it are going to go off, and this hasn't run its course. And I did want to say earlier on, the most important thing about all of this, which hasn't been focused on, is the collapse of the Metropolitan Police leadership. And this is the thing to come out of it. And people don't seem to be focusing on that. The police are, of course, publicly funded, and they've been corrupt. And Murdoch wasn't asked why his employees got into giving bribes to the Metropolitan Police. This is basic. He's responsible, and so are they, and there needs to be more than just a judicial commission in England. There needs to be a royal commission into the police, the Metropolitan Police Force. Well, if nothing else, it sounds like there'll be a lot of criminal hearings involving those police where some of this might come out. Well, to the media in Australia, and the question of whether David Hicks should be allowed to keep any of the money made from the selling of his story about his detention in Guantanamo Bay. The Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions is taking the convicted terrorism supporter to court under the Proceeds of Crime Act to seize profits from his memoir. So far, it's sold 30,000 copies. The Attorney-General wasn't giving much away today.
I think the recovery provisions, the proceeds of crime legislation is appropriate and is appropriately framed. It does have regard to the nature of the overseas offence in correlation to domestic offences. I speak there in the broad rather than the specifics of David Hicks' case. But Terry Hicks says his son is being persecuted by Australian authorities and he's not illegally profiting from crime because his conviction is invalid. Today, David Hicks wouldn't comment on the court proceedings, but in an interview recorded in May for a forthcoming ABC special, he said he hopes the Proceeds of Crime action would give him his day in an Australian court.
I would relish the opportunity if the government attempted to take my money, because it would mean for the very first time I get to go in front of a real judge in a real court and to have my case thrashed out, and the government would have to establish that I had actually breached a law or committed a crime, which has been acknowledged by all sides involved that I didn't. So I would relish the opportunity for that court case.
Well, Greg Barnes, could this work for David Hicks as he suggests?
I think he makes a very good point, and a very valid point. I was surprised to see that the DPP had done this. It's obviously the matter's got to go to court now, but I mean, normally these laws are applied to people who, for example, are major drug traffickers or various other crimes where there's a lot of personal gain. Here you didn't have a conviction in an Australian court. You didn't even have a conviction in an American court. You had these kangaroo courts regarded with disdain by the legal profession the world over, where Hicks was played around with by Howard and Bush for a few years and then brought back to Australia. And then they say, oh, this is proceeds of crime. I mean, I do find it interesting, and I think he's probably right. I think it will give him an opportunity because they do have to get over some hurdles in order to seize that money.
You talk about where it's usually been applied. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm aware, in terms of books, of only two such actions in the Australian law. This one against David Hicks, and a previous move against Schapelle Corby. Both were in overseas jurisdictions, and in both cases, the Corby and the Hicks families were critical of Australian authorities' roles in the investigation of their crimes. Bruce Hay, what does it say?
Incompetence. I mean, this is vindictive, this action, because as Greg has quite rightly pointed out, and he's made all the points that I would have made, this is at best, a very messy situation. What's the name of that crook, Reid? Chopper Reid.
Chopper Reid.
Well, they didn't go for Chopper, and if anybody should have had the proceeds of crime act or whatever it is thrown at him, it should have been dear old Chopper. I think it is vindictive and it's incompetent, and as Hicks says, if it goes to court and he has his chance to put it out there, it could well blow back in their faces. Why would they do that?
You stole my thunder there, Bruce, because here was my chance to be Jennifer Burns for a moment. I was going to suggest here are some books that haven't been pursued. Chopper from the Inside, Mark Reid, Howard Marks, the British drug kingpin, international drug, huge international seller. Roger Rogerson, The Dark Side. Yeah. He twice convicted. Of course, we shouldn't forget Lord Jeffrey Archer's Prison Diaries. Jessica Brown, why weren't those authors pursued in this way?
That's a very good question. I mean, my view on it is, and I'm not so much of a Hicks defender as both of you, but I'm a bit of a free marketer, and I think, you know, I've spent the whole week vigorously defending the press and the freedom of people to say whatever they like in public, and I don't really think the government should take people's income away from them for doing something as innocuous as writing a book. So I don't think that, you know, this has had a lot of legs in it.
On to another media gag today. Radio personality Darren Hinch has been sentenced to home detention after being found guilty of contempt of court for naming 2 sex offenders. Still recovering from a liver transplant, the man known as the Human Headline avoided a jail term, but he's been banned from broadcasting for 5 months. And he's not allowed to use social media either. Hinch is an avid Twitter user. He says he'll stay silent, but not for long. Greg, have you heard of a court issuing a tweeting ban before?
I think there was one in relation to, or some orders made in relation to the young woman who has allegedly had some involvement with St Kilda footballers earlier this year. But I think you're going to see more of it, Tim, because this is a form of media now, you know, Hinch thrives on publicity and he thrives on the capacity to be able to say anything at any time, and this is a genuine punishment for Hinch. For some people, they couldn't care less. But if he wasn't in the medical condition he was in, he would have gone to jail because he's got priors for this. But I do think we're going to see more of these sort of... The social media is going to play a much bigger role in the law. What you say on Facebook now can end up in court as evidence. And what you say on Twitter can end up as evidence. So I think it is a reminder that you're not beyond the jurisdiction of the courts.
Is that fair, Jessica Brown? I mean, should a court have the power to silence a journalist from social media? Beyond that, if everyone's got the same status on Twitter, should they have the power to silence citizens?
Well, that's what's really interesting, and I think it's really interesting that this case has come up today on the same day that we're also talking about privacy, because I think a lot of the same issues overlap. Again, talking about media regulation, what media would you regulate? Do you regulate Twitter? Should the government be regulating what people say on Facebook? Can the courts do that? I mean, these are all big issues that need to be sorted out. In terms of going back to the public interest, I mean, this is really... Hinch was naming accused pedophiles or convicted pedophiles. This is a question of the subjectivity of the public interest. Some people would say that's really in the public interest to know that, and others would say, well, you know, they have the right not to have that broadcast. So, again, I think it really shows up that there's very much a case-by-case basis with these type of things, and I think it's really interesting as part of this broader privacy discussion.
Bruce, that underlying law about the naming of sex offenders, Darren Hinch insists it's bad law. He'll return to campaign against it, hopes to see it knocked out one day. Is it bad law?
I don't think it's bad law. I mean, it's done to protect people who may not have committed the crime. It's also done to protect people from lynch gangs and that sort of thing. But in Hinch's case, if you're talking about this, it's the old British thing, the punishment fits the crime. This really does get to Hinch in a way that nothing else would. I don't understand why he's done this. I mean, if he wants to change the law, there's much better ways of doing it. And as Greg says, he's a publicity seeker, and I agree with what Jessica says. So, I mean, this is a bit of a storm in a teacup.
Take away every avenue of his voice.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Well, the federal government has confirmed a major crackdown on employers hiring illegal workers from overseas. Immigration Minister Chris Bowen says he'll accept the findings of an independent report by legal expert Stephen Howells. It found more than 100,000 immigrants could be working without visas, the growing problem partly linked to organised crime and sexual exploitation.
Current law doesn't provide a disincentive for employers to hire illegal workers because it is simply too difficult and complex to launch a successful prosecution. Mr Howes recommends a number of changes to the law. He recommends new levels of penalty, civil penalties and infringement notices to make it easier for the Department of Immigration and for the Director of Public Prosecutions to take action.
Jessica Brown, previous attempts to bring illegal workers to light didn't target employers deliberately. It was decided it was too punitive. Now they do. It could be up to $10,000, I think the report said, per worker. Is it time for the employers accepted the legal responsibility?
I think it makes sense to me to have the responsibility lie with the employers. But again, I think this points to a much bigger issue. I mean, illegal work is something that is clearly not unique to Australia. It happens all over the world. But I think this points to a much bigger issue of there's clearly a demand for these types of jobs. There's clearly a demand for people to work in fairly low-paid, low-skilled occupations. And there's a lot of other things that get in the way of that, our current immigration system, our current industrial relations system. So I think this points to a much bigger issue, that there is a demand for this type of labour out there.
Greg Barnes, there's a demand for this type of labour. It isn't really what it's showing up, that there's a demand for this type of labour at very low, below market costs, and that, you know, you could say this is a sop to the unions, that finally they're getting employers to have to account or find it too risky to hire foreign workers.
Well, I think what it does show, I agree with Jessica, I think what it does show, as it does in the other area of Chris Bowen's portfolio of people smugglers, you have a failure of the regulatory system. There is demand for workers. I mean, America runs on illegal workers. You take them all out of the system. So did Britain during the boom, and most of Europe. There's so much hypocrisy about this issue. But like people smugglers, the official channels and the official avenues don't often work because we have this highly regulated visa system, a highly complex Migration Act that's about that thick, and under this government, the unions have far too much say. I mean, I object to the term illegal workers. I mean, illegal in whose eyes? Simply in Chris Bowen's eyes.
And well, they don't have work permits.
Well,
they don't have visas.
But they don't have work permits in the US. And what it's led to in the US, of course, is this sort of vigilantism of the hard right. And that's what I fear at Chris Bowen is, you know, now saying, no, we've got a problem with illegal workers. I mean,
interesting then that this didn't come up under the Howard government, who chose not to go ahead with prosecution of employers.
I think it was right. I mean, I'm a great fan of the Howard government, as you know, but I mean, I think it was right. I think this is a nonsense, and I think that Stephen Howell's report starts from a premise that you need to regulate this because there's a problem, and I just don't think there is a problem. And as Jessica says, there's obviously demand in the market, as there is in the US.
I think it also points to, I think it also really points to Australia has, compared to other countries around the world, and especially around the region, a very high minimum wage. And I think this also shows...
That's what a lot of this is about, is it not?
Oh, I think that's exactly what it is. I think it shows that there is demand for people to work under that wage, and that, if you like, I think we might see some of these industries, you know, the at-home garment construction type of industries probably moving offshore. They just simply won't be viable without having that kind of black market.
That would be an interesting outcome. Bruce Haig, looking at the employers, willful blindness was the catchphrase out of the Murdoch hearing the other day. Do you think employers have indulged in a bit of willful blindness, hiring cheap workers and not looking too closely at where they come from?
Well, as you know, I live in rural Australia, and there's a need for people to prune olive trees and fruit trees and vineyards, and yet we have a huge labour shortage because the mines, and I'm from Mudgee, the mines are just sucking taking all the labour, sucking all the labour force out of these areas. It's not only in Mudgee. So
because of what they pay.
Yeah, they pay. I mean, an ordinary worker on the mines in Mudgee would be taking home anywhere between $90,000 to $150,000, and some of them are on $220,000. Now, how do you? So there is a need now. I suspect that a lot of the people that are doing the vineyard work are so-called illegal. Now, I take Greg's point absolutely, but there is an issue here. One is that the Immigration Department have focused almost exclusively on the people coming in by boat and ignored completely the scams that are running. And this, I think...
These are almost entirely people who've flown in, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah. And having been in Foreign Affairs and having seen some of the things that happen, having been on the Refugee Review Tribunal, what's required is a judicial inquiry into the Department of Immigration, because there's no doubt that there's corruption involved and there's paybacks involved, particularly in that area and it includes the police, of bringing women into this country for reasons of prostitution.
Well, there's no doubt about that. There is no doubt about that aspect, and no one supports that. But I do think in relation to your example, though, Bruce, if you're in the US, the problem would be solved by Mexico.
Yes, well, you have to come here by boat, by plane, whereas in America you can physically cross the border.
Right. The problem is servicing the second gear of a two-speed economy. Is that what you're talking about?
That's a good way to put it, Tim. That's a good way to put it.
The carbon tax may overcome that problem by putting money back into the bottom end of the socio-economic scale, and that seems to me what half of this is about. But the problem is we're not catching the money off all of these profits from the mining industry and returning it into Australia through hospitals, education, infrastructure. Now that's not happening, and so that's the two-tier economy is running because of the huge inefficiency of government.
Jessica Brown, could it lead to, as well as companies rushing offshore, if this was really prosecuted and a lot of firms found this cheap labour potentially dry up, could it lead to a wage spiral, inflation, more problems for the government?
It could. I think probably before we saw that, we would see, because I think the wage inflation is, as you said, being pushed, is being driven by the mining industry. I think we could probably see businesses going under. I'm sure there's a lot of businesses who do rely on cash labour and would probably go under.
Well, coming up next on The Drum, the Space Shuttle's historic final mission comes to an end. We talk to astronomer Professor Fred Watson.
Both major parties are treating the carbon campaign like an election campaign. Senior government ministers did at least 100 different interviews today. They've been dispatched to all corners of the country, ordered to sell a complex package in simple language.
In northern Kenya, the drought front line is pushing deeper into the country. Livestock, people and wildlife are all struggling to survive. With no rain in sight, the drought is only likely to worsen, ensuring even greater hardship.
If these latest allegations are correct, it could have serious implications for News International. It's already killed the News of the World. What if the Sun and Sunday Times were also involved? The question is, what will Rupert Murdoch do next? He's already killed one publication. Is it possible the whole of News International could go the same way? Now that might seem like wild speculation, but after what's happened in the last week, anything's possible.
On Australian Story, a family facing a genetic time bomb.
I always thought that my children would never have children.
A daughter's search for a solution.
I had to get more creative in my way to have children.
It's like Murphy's Law. What could go wrong is going wrong.
And the saviour who can give them a future.
I don't know that we could get any closer.
Randy was absolutely convinced there was more than one.
Australian Story, Saturday at 6:30.
Coming up on this week's 1+1, the Australian media unloved and under scrutiny when authors become activists and Randa Abdel Fattah on her road to the West Bank. That's 1+1 this weekend on ABC News 24.
Well, the final Space Shuttle mission will come to an end tonight. After spending 13 days in orbit, Atlantis has been cleared by NASA officials for landing at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It will bring to an end America's 30-year Space Shuttle program, which carried out 135 missions and was marred by tragedy twice. So, Fred Watson, does this all bring a tear? I should introduce you, sorry. I guess Fred Watson from the Anglo-Australian Observatory has been watching this. Fred Watson, does it all bring a tear to an astronomer's eye?
Well, there's a pang of nostalgia, of course, because this has been such a triumphant programme in its 30-year history, as you said, marred by two tragedies, but 135 launches. And I guess when I think about it, I cast my mind back to the way things were in 1975, which was at the end of something called the Apollo-Soyuz program. And nobody really knew what was coming after that. We knew that there was this wonderful shuttle machine, but we didn't know how well it would perform. And I think now we're in the same situation. We're unsure about what will happen next, but whatever it will be, it is sure to be a triumph.
I remember another astronomer suggested to me when the Mir, I think, was decommissioned.
Yes.
That
Yep.
if you took a look inside it at the time, it was starting to resemble the technology of a VW combi van. This 30 years old, the space shuttle, predates the first Holden Commodore even.
That's right.
What sort of a power of technology is this old beast on?
Well, it's, you know, think back to before mobile phones, things that had dials on them and were hooked up to a telephone exchange. The technology, of course, things like the computer technology that is used to fly the shuttle has been updated. They now have what are called glass cockpits, which are what you find in modern commercial airliners. But the airframes are 30 years old. The design of much of the hardware itself is 30 years old. And it is also very expensive. It's a very expensive way of getting people in and out of space. And all those things together really have brought the programme to an end.
Well, a cheaper way is coming, supposedly. What is next in terms of servicing the space station?
Well, in the short term, it's a question of America sort of putting some old rivalries behind it and using the Soyuz spacecraft of Roscosmos, the Russian Federal Space Agency. So
beyond that, a very American solution, private enterprise.
And then private enterprise, that's right, which is the Obama vision for the future of NASA, and probably the correct one too, in terms of actually reinvigorating the space program, the human space flight program, and getting private ventures involved, and probably bringing some very, very interesting new ideas into it.
NASA, Sean, of 3,000 workers, but you talked about speculating about what might come with the shuttle era. What do you think might come from the new era? What's Orion, for example?
Yes, Orion's the next generation capsule, and in some senses it's a back to the future vision, because what you do with Orion is put a relatively small capsule on top of a long stick of rockets, which inherently is actually a much safer and cheaper way of getting humans into space. But then what you also do is have separate heavy lift vehicles which can take robotic cargo ships up to the space station. So you basically divide the functions of the shuttle into two halves.
And how far do they plan on sending Orion long term?
Well, one day perhaps Orion might go around the moon and may even form the nucleus of a spacecraft that might take humans to one of the moons of Mars, which is one of the next targets on the wish list.
Quite remarkable. So, this has always been, the space race has always been a big thing about psychology of nations. What sort of moment are we at in the psychology of America that, for a start, they're having their Russians ferrying their astronauts for a few years?
I think it's, you know, the space station itself, if nothing else, it is a truly international venture and really paves the way for future space missions in a very strongly cooperative rather than competitive environment. The old Cold War rivalries are largely gone. The things that drove humankind's quest to land on the moon, that is now a thing of the past. It was a historical moment which was right for the time. But we're now in an era where really the only way you can do this is for nations to pull together. So my guess is that the next landing craft on the moon will perhaps have a Russian pilot, an American commander, and maybe a Chinese engineer and some Indian scientists. Who knows?
That would be remarkable. And what sort of time frame are we looking at, if you'd like to have a guess, for the moons of Mars? The moons of Mars.
Okay, the moons of Mars is probably 2025, something like that. It's a few years down the track, but
a launch at 2025. How long would it take to get there?
It depends how you do it, but if you press the button at the right time and use the right kind of rocket, you can actually do it in a matter of months from the Earth to Mars.
And in the interim, what are the Chinese doing? Are they going to fill some of this vacuum in space technology?
The Chinese and the Indians have both declared their intention to land astronauts on the moon before that time, and they both have space programs that are progressing well. But my guess is that at some point that will all become part of a much bigger multinational venture.
And when do you see that coming to fruition, do you think? For a moon landing?
For a moon landing, probably within the next 8 to 10 years.
Quite remarkable. So we'd be talking altogether something like 50 years between the last moon landing and the next one.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
What a remarkable venture. Fred Watson from the Anglo-Australian Observatory, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy watching a successful landing tonight, I'm sure, as you hope. And a reminder that the Space Shuttle Atlantis is due to re-enter the Earth tonight, just before 8 p.m. Eastern Time, if it takes the first of those opportunities that NASA slated. ABC News 24 will have live coverage of that historic landing, and at 7:30, a special report from Scott Bevan on the future of the American space program. That is all for us for now, though, at The Drum. Thank you very much to Professor Fred Watson and to our panel, Greg Barnes, Jessica Brown and Bruce Haig. And you can check out our website at abc.net.au/The Drum. Peter Wilkins will be here tomorrow.